No one anticipated that Melania Trump's lawsuit against Jasmine Crockett would turn into a public reckoning until, in less than 10 seconds, one witness disclosed the truth that altered everything. The ground rocked beneath Washington's feet as soon as the headline appeared. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is being sued by First Lady Melania Trump for defamation. This is not a rumor or conjecture. For many Americans, it was a legitimate court document with Melania Trump's name at the top. How big the storm would get was the question, not if this would cause one. Consider a First Lady, someone who has typically kept quiet during political disputes, chose to take a rising Democratic star to court, which was sufficient to ensure. Reporters throng the cameras outside the courthouse, while cable networks fill the airwaves with unending conjecture. However, the realization that this case wasn't about policy was what truly left people speechless. During power disputes in Congress, Jasmine Crockett's words became the focus. Scathing and straightforward, which Melania's team said had gone too far into slander, and in the modern world. The stakes couldn't have been higher in a situation when every sentence could be tweeted, cut, replayed, and examined. It all started at the Dallas courthouse early in the morning, when the Texas heat made the air sticky. However, that didn't stop the throng from standing shoulder to shoulder with Trump supporters while holding homemade signs. Reporters, draped in flags, leaned over barricades and yelled questions at every local woman passing by in a suit. Whispering to a friend while standing on the corner with a cup of iced coffee, "This feels bigger than a trial." The atmosphere is reminiscent of the past, with journalists seated on hefty oak benches. Two ladies whose lives couldn't be more different were able to get in front of legal professionals and interested bystanders. Melania is graceful and taciturn, yet her every gesture is measured, furious, and unrepentant. Mrs. Trump against Representative Crockett, with a look that challenged anyone to keep her quiet. Everybody's eyes turned forward as the clerk's comments echoed through the room. It took a collision of legacies to comprehend why this meant so much. It wasn't simply another litigation. Jasmine Crockett is someone you should be aware of since she doesn't shy away from controversy. As a freshman representative from Texas, she made a name for herself by challenging opponents and advocating for local communities. She is frequently overlooked in political hallways. Instead of whispering, she projects. That is one of the reasons she became so well known so rapidly, and it is also the reason why someone as well off as Melania Trump would risk going up against her in court, but lawsuits are never easy. Crockett's comments weren't about political teasing, according to Melania's team, who said she implied. Melania's financial practices were the subject of allegations that were devastating enough to lead to this judicial battle. This served as a warning to Crockett's followers and a means of preserving dignity for Melania's fans. As the attorneys entered, the White House cameras clicked frantically, seemingly in an attempt to silence a voice that had sounded. Reporters scrawled notes as quickly as they could, paying attention to every little detail, even Melania's clothing color, Crockett's facial expression, and the way each woman shifted her position, because everyone was aware. This case concerned narrative and picture perception in addition to the courts. Crockett leaned in to whisper something to her lawyer, who gave her a slight nod in reply. Melania held her pen firmly against her folder without flinching, her expression impassive. These two women differed not only in their ideologies but also in their methods. Melania painstakingly created a portrait of quiet that only speaks when called upon. Crockett's outspoken and fearless demeanor challenges the established order of power. One thing became evident in the early hours of that morning: regardless of the verdict, neither woman would escape this trial unscathed. The entire country would be watching and waiting for the spark as reputations would be put to the test and secrets would be alluded to. Outside chants surged louder, and that might ignite something bigger than both of them. While some applauded Jasmine's bravery in speaking up, others yelled support for Melania and called Crockett foolish. In the wooden courtroom, cops were stationed on the steps to prevent emotions from escalating even when the chances appeared to be in favor. The quiet between disputes was more audible than the yelling outside, where history had already begun to write itself. Everyone understood that this was about perception versus reality, not just a lawsuit. The risky gamble of carrying words into a courtroom and the conflict between bravery and control. However, people were already wondering who would emerge from this trial stronger before the first argument was even made. And if you want to know why this lawsuit went viral, who would depart with their legacy irreparably damaged? You need to know Jasmine Crockett's true identity, not just what the headlines and talking points say. However, the backstory of the fiery voice that brought her to the courtroom against Melania Trump. Prior to ever serving in Congress, Jasmine Crockett did not advance through the political ranks in a discreet manner. She established her reputation in Dallas courtrooms by defending those without the resources or contacts to defend themselves. She was the lawyer who would answer late-night calls from frightened fathers or mothers whose sons had been arrested. Who was afraid of losing his job due to a miscommunication because residents of those neighborhoods knew Jasmine as more than simply a lawyer. They recognized Jasmine as someone who was willing to battle and never gave up on a challenging case. Remembered that she wasn't afraid of judges, having worked with local activist Andre Phillips years before. She felt that prosecutors and others should look people in the eye and deliver the truth, even if it wasn't pretty. She was successful in local politics because of her direct honesty, which was so painful that it made people uncomfortable. She honed her phrases for impact rather than for comfort on the journey to Washington. And it worked. Critics believed Jasmine would eventually calm down if she was elected to Congress. After arriving in Washington, D.C., many people learned to play the game, but she didn't do anything. Her voice only became louder in news interviews and on social media and on committee floors. Crockett gained notoriety for responding with a clap whenever someone attempted to interrupt her or downplay her argument. She wasn't just talking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had warned her that she was a target because she disregarded political etiquette and that we don't have a voice up there. When she entered, lobbyists who didn't like her career politicians rolled their eyes. While leftists viewed her as a welcome change, conservative media portrayed her as reckless. And Jasmine appeared unconcerned throughout, so when she mentioned Melania Trump's part, no one was shocked by the audacity of her remarks during some of the Trump administration's interactions, but they were shocked by the reaction. Melania took action rather than ignoring her and dismissing it as political theater. On a morning talk show, a reporter questioned why, of all the detractors the Trump family has encountered, Jasmine wasn't the most well-known name in Congress, so why single out this congresswoman? That question persisted. She was neither the most powerful nor the chair of a committee, she wasn't a presidential candidate. But in some way, she had touched a nerve so strongly that the U.S. First Lady chose to sue her. Crockett's boldness played a role, she wasn't someone you could scare into silence. Threats of legal action did not destabilize her, on the contrary, they strengthened her, which was risky for someone like Melania, who had established her public persona by poise, control, and a cautious avoidance of controversy. Jasmine, on the other hand, was unapologetic, frank, and raw. Additionally, for millions of viewers, this was more than just a legal dispute between two women. Two very different Americas collided, with a congresswoman from humble roots on one side. Battled her way through law school and established her reputation as an uncensored first lady with international renown. A name linked to riches, power, and a meticulously maintained reputation at the time of the lawsuit. Instead of giving up, Jasmine stood outside her Dallas district office and leaned closer. She told reporters that I should be in court if telling the truth about power puts me there. Supporters applauded her bravery as her words, "I don't run, I don't hide," played repeatedly on networks. Critics criticized it for being conceited, but everyone agreed that Jasmine Crockett wasn't afraid. She was hazardous in politics because of her fearlessness, which also made her appealing to her fans. And that's what turned this lawsuit into a test of whether someone who had consistently challenged authority could withstand being struck directly by one of the nation's most powerful individuals. However, her employees understood the stress behind the audacious remarks made late at night in her office. With piles of court documents on her desk, Jasmine occasionally massaged her temples, aware of the dangers involved. She told an aide that they wanted to break me, but if I bend now, I won't be able to get up ever again. The case was about survival, not simply cleaning her name for Jasmine. If she lost, she would run the risk of being permanently labeled reckless, both politically and personally. Even the nation's highest office couldn't stop her if she won, but Jasmine's defiance garnered media attention. What motivated Melania to risk everything by bringing her to court in the first place was still the more significant question. While her husband made headlines, Melania Trump spent years cultivating a reputation for remaining silent. And cultivated controversy, she remained largely silent, spoke infrequently, and made strategic appearances. When word leaked out that she had chosen to sue Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, it was because she had carefully managed her image. People were shocked since the absence of a first lady was not only rare but historic. Had ever brought a sitting congresswoman before a judge for defamation in contemporary times, therefore it was clear why now. Why Melania's life was always more brittle than it appeared, despite its shiny exterior. Being First Lady meant being closely watched at all times, it wasn't only about clothes and parties. While maintaining a certain mystique, her motivations were questioned and her private life was examined. Melania's legal team said that Crockett's remarks had breached that well-built armor. The Congresswoman said that Crockett had inferred involvement in behind-the-scenes activities, which went beyond political criticism. Transactions that might severely damage Melania's reputation for a woman who had spent years cultivating an elegant persona. and separation from the turmoil in Washington, those remarks were not only offensive but also harmful. According to a legal analyst on CBS, she is defending herself rather than her spouse. Her identity and dignity inside the East Wing are at issue in this case. Before the case was filed, experts fought for weeks. Some claimed it would simply draw more attention to Crockett. Others claimed that by portraying her as a fighter against authority, her quiet would be interpreted as weakness. Melania ultimately declared, "I will not tolerate lies," on her own. She allegedly informed an assistant that her decision had significant risks and that her voice was sharp and unusually strong. By filing, she allowed the media to investigate her past and subject her to scrutiny, cross-examinations, and depositions. Things Melania had long avoided, but she wasn't behaving impulsively. She thought this case might be her chance. Supporters gathered at rallies in Texas and Florida to demonstrate her strength on her own terms. Women held signs that read, "Protect Melania's dignity." Conservative pundits commended her for at last. Even detractors acknowledged that retaliating was brave, but bravery has two sides. Political consultant Karen Villarreal stated on MSNBC that Jasmine Crockett saw the lawsuit as a gift, saying, "You just handed her a microphone." Crockett no longer needs to battle for attention because this lawsuit ensures her daily airtime. Nevertheless, Melania was no stranger to danger. She had handled controversies in the past and maintained her poise when others would have lost it. She thought her team could deal with Crockett, but once a lawsuit starts, control tends to elude them. Judges render judgments, witnesses divulge information, and journalists go into unexpected places. And there was the risk of using Crockett to court Melania, who wasn't merely protecting her reputation. Inside the courthouse, she was gambling with it, and her lawyers spoke in a measured tone, presenting Crockett's comments as careless defamation that made it difficult to distinguish fact from fantasy. They cited Crockett's aggressive demeanor and her track record of using incisive language that pierced deeply. Melania's primary attorney stated that this is about accountability and not politics. Melania herself kept quiet for the most part because it is about preserving the honor of the U.S. First Lady. Her face was inscrutable, but occasionally she would scribble notes and send them to her lawyer. The pulsating excitement around her was contrasted with her calm, chilly demeanor, according to observers. For a brief while, it appeared that the lawsuit may succeed because the legal foundation was strong and the arguments were clear. However, because every defamation action has a burden, fissures were already beginning to appear beneath the surface. Crockett's attorneys were aware that proof necessitates the context of evidence and testimony. They planned an offense as well as a defense, while observers outside the courtroom discussed Melania's intentions incessantly. Some claimed it was a sign of pride, while others proposed it was a purposeful diversion from other issues raging in Washington. One late-night show even made a joke about it. When a congresswoman is sued by a first lady, it's referred to as ratings rather than defamation. Despite all of the cynicism, there was more to this. Melania had always been a representation of grace, of control and silence, therefore she attempted to reinterpret herself by bringing this lawsuit. Although I wouldn't be bullied, symbols are brittle and swiftly break when they break. Reporters gathered outside the Dallas courthouse were aware that they were witnessing history. This was more than just a court case. It was a clash of personalities, reputations, and the fundamental question of who in America gets to define what is true. Melania faced a huge risk, but Jasmine Crockett saw an invaluable opportunity. However, if Melania thought she had the better argument, she was going to discover that legal battles aren't solely won by attorneys. Moments are what win them, and one moment in particular would quickly turn the trial around. There have been high-profile trials at Dallas Earl Cable Federal Building before, but none have been quite like this. The courthouse appeared more like the focal point of a national show than a place of justice as soon as the sun rose. Reporters from as far afield as Miami and Los Angeles fought for camera space as satellite trucks lined the roadway. To demonstrate their presence, a number of Southern Methodist University students slept out overnight. The air conditioner buzzed inside to combat the Texas heat, but the tense atmosphere of the crowded courtroom made it feel heavy. The smell of coffee wafted in from paper cups held by weary journalists, almost overwhelming them. Everyone leaned forward, expecting for the gavel to fall, as they hadn't slept well in days. Melania Trump sat in perfect posture on the front row, her beige outfit crisp. Every time she lifted a glass of water or adjusted her pen, her hair was fixed in its typical polished wave. Jasmine Crockett, a few feet away, exuded a different kind of energy that appeared to be intentional practice. She leaned slightly forward in her chair and periodically whispered to her lawyer while she flipped through the notes. When a camera clicked too loudly, Crockett's features flared with irritation, in contrast to Melania's expressionless visage. Enjoyment every time her gaze strayed to Melania's table and her assistant would pass her a cheeky comment steal. The judge was a tall man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and the reporters whispered to each other that they don't even look at each other. Swiftly entered and sat down, declaring that the court was now in session. Even though he seemed to understand that this was not an average instance, his speech held the weight of routine. Philip Ransom, Melania's principal lawyer, stood up to speak as the proceedings got underway, and his tone was fluid and almost theatrical. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is straightforward and was prepared for the jury as well as the cameras. Representative Crockett went beyond the bounds of free speech. She didn't question political strategy or critique policies. She made inappropriate accusations against the U.S. First Lady for which she lacked proof. These claims were broadcast repeatedly, and millions of people considered them to be defamatory rather than political. Following a hushed conversation in the courtroom, Crockett scrawled a note and handed it to her lawyer, Linda Garvey, who gave a quick sneer before putting it in her folder. When Ransom took a seat, Garvey got up. This trial isn't about preserving dignity, as seen by her deliberate stride and voice cutting. My client discussed how to impact accountability and transparency while stifling criticism. Mrs. Trump may not agree with what was said, but disapproval is not the same as defamation, the exact things we demand of our leaders. Attempting to silence a current member of Congress for carrying out her duties is a risky precedent, and truth is not defamation. As Garvey talked, Crockett looked at the jury and made eye contact with a middle-aged woman in the front row, who scrawled frantically in her notebook. The tension increased as each side presented their initial points of contention. Every remark appeared to be tailored for the 12 jurors as well as the millions of viewers on television and the internet. This is going to be the trial of the decade, muttered a Dallas Morning News reporter as she quickly tapped at her laptop. A man wearing a battered baseball cap leaned toward his wife as people behind him spoke back and forth on the benches. As he watched the First Lady sue a congresswoman, he stated quietly, "I don't care what you think about politics. That's crazy." At one recess, Crockett was drinking water next to the defense table. A reporter from the gallery asked a lawmaker if she regretted her remarks, and she immediately said that she did. "The only thing I regret is how fragile the truth seems for some people," she said, her voice echoing across the room. Back in session, tension increased as the comment caused Melania's team to stare at her sharply and her fans to laugh. A political consultant explained how Crockett's words affected the situation as witnesses were called to testify. Had been aired on television, making headlines. Melania's lawyers highlighted the damage to her reputation. However, Crockett's team retorted that since prominent individuals are constantly in the spotlight, criticism is inevitable. Even the judge appeared to realize by the afternoon that the case was no longer limited to slander statutes, it was turning into a conflict about the right to free expression itself, and his gavel struck the bench. Following a violent argument between the lawyers, he sternly advised, "Control yourselves." Did little to calm the tense situation, but sketch artists continued to be there despite the courtroom's ban on cameras. From frantically recording each look, eyebrow lift, and emotional glimmer between the two women. In one drawing, Crockett was seen bending forward and pointing a finger aggressively across the table. As the day came to an end, Melania's lips were pushed firmly as she looked straight ahead. Both sides had set their battle lines, and the air within the courtroom felt even heavier than it had at the start. Even though only the initial stones had been thrown, it was evident to everyone that neither woman had recoiled. Though the actual turning point wasn't in the opening arguments, this was going to be a war unlike anything the nation had ever witnessed. It awaited us in the specifics of Melania's case, and Crockett's team was ready to launch an offensive. Reporters ran up the courthouse steps on the second morning of the trial, when the courtroom's rhythm had already been set. Security queues extended around the block before daybreak, with many gripping phones and laptops. A diverse group of political assistants, interested law students, and regular Texans quickly packed the benches. Philip Ransom, Melania Trump's principal lawyer, who had never before seen a First Lady up close when the judge nodded. He wore a navy suit that appeared freshly pressed despite the humid Dallas air, and he rose with purposeful assurance. And he spoke with a clarity that came from decades of expertise in the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began by saying, "this case is not about politics. Words have consequences. It concerns the facts and reputation," and Representative Crockett went too far. Her accusations that the First Lady was involved in unfounded matters were not casual comments. Millions of Americans were exposed to these claims, and the harm they caused was genuine. "The First Lady is not present as a politician," he said after pausing to allow the silence to linger for a moment. "She is here as a mother, wife, and lady whose name has been tarnished. Please hold Representative Crockett responsible for the jurors' expressionless silence." Journalists wrote frantically behind them, their pens scratching across notebooks. Melania maintained a straight face and folded her hands in her lap, although occasionally she leaned in Ransom's direction. Ransom called the first witness, a media analyst from Arizona named Simon Leary, while mumbling something too soft to hear. Leary, who was an expert at monitoring the dissemination of stories on social media and television, displayed charts and graphs, demonstrating how, in the weeks following her comments, Crockett's words were snipped, shared, and played back thousands of times. Leary clarified that these remarks weren't limited to Washington but spread around the country. They entered the news cycle, and the harm to the First Lady's reputation grew with each rerun. Ransom nodded. Did Representative Crockett's remarks affect how Americans saw the First Lady, in your professional opinion? Yes, Larry said emphatically, they portrayed her in a negative and deceptive manner. Crockett leaned back and tapped her pen against the table as the jury scrawled notes. Ransom then brought in a public relations specialist after she fixed the witness with a gaze that could cut through steel. Phoenix resident Dana Mercer, who provided testimony regarding the potential harm to one's reputation. She discussed the long-lasting impact of public scandal, missed opportunities, and strained connections with organizations. According to Mercer, the nature of perception is such that if people believe a misleading story, even after it has been corrected, the harm persists. Ransom turned to face the jury. This is about careless remarks directed at an individual, not about critiquing the policy. The individual seated here made a move in Melania's direction for the first time since the trial started. Melania gazed at the jurors with her eyes raised, but she didn't frown or grin. A calm expression that conveyed both strength and weakness, but if Melania's argument was strong on appearances. When Crockett's lawyer, Linda Garvey, stood up for cross-examination, fissures appeared during interrogation. Mr. Leary, Garvey's tone changed, and you testified that Representative Crockett's remarks went nicely. Circulated swiftly throughout the nation, which is accurate. Do you feel that the First Lady is already among the most closely watched women worldwide? Larry paused before answering. And do you believe that public people receive criticism as part of their duties, sometimes harsh criticism? Indeed, what you're claiming isn't that Representative Crockett sparked the investigation, but that she added to an existing criticism loop. Ransom protested, but the judge permitted the inquiry. One way to look at it is that Leary shifted uneasily, and the jurors did look at one another. Reporters scribbled more quickly, and Garvey pressed Mercer, the PR expert, about reputational harm. However, if a statement is accurate, is it still defamatory without Mercer's admission? And the court would be the one to evaluate if it is true or not. Precisely the response Garvey was looking for. She gave a small smile and went back to her seat. Although Melania's case had gotten off to a promising start, Crockett's team had already started to uncover flaws, and the momentum appeared to be waning. Reporters flocked to the courthouse steps at lunch recess in the foundation, microphones pushed in all directions. The Texas Tribune journalist posed the direct question, if Melania wins, does that mean every member of Congress must be careful what they say, or is she shielding herself from falsehoods? Where does the line lie? Inside, Melania sat peacefully at the plaintiff's table while her lawyers gathered around her. Crockett. When she and her colleagues laughed, it sounded like two distinct planets to those outside the room. At the end of the day, one was filled with assertive energy while the other was entrenched in controlled stillness. Words matter, reputations matter, and Crockett's remarks had repercussions. The jury had heard the crux of Melania's case. However, nobody anticipated how drastically the power dynamics would change when Crockett's side got their turn. However, Jasmine Crockett's attorneys weren't simply prepared to answer when it came time for her defense. By the time the defense hit the stage, they were ready to turn the story around. Reporters had already started to frame the trial as a test of free speech, and the courtroom was humming with excitement. Crockett sat at her table with her arms folded and her face composed, despite her reputation. But her lawyer Linda Garvey's enthusiasm was evident, like a boxer waiting for the bell. Rose holding a huge binder, but Garvey added, "Ladies and gentlemen," her opening statement was noteless. Her voice was calm but forceful. This case is about silencing a voice, not about preserving dignity. A voice that has spoken the truth about power and influence and raised difficult questions. Representative Crockett expressed what millions of Americans were already requesting. She did not create anything. And the gallery was shaken by the First Lady's desire to punish her for speaking it out. A man in the back row leaned forward in his chair when Crockett looked at the jury and locked eyes with him. Her eyes sent the message, "I'm not afraid to stand here, even if she didn't grin." Dr. Anthony Ward, a political historian from the University of Texas at Austin, was Garvey's first witness. According to Ward, democracy depends on examination, which is why elected officials have a tradition of challenging public figures' actions. He stated that if we punish legislators, public criticism is not only acceptable but also anticipated. For discussing those in authority, we undermine the system as a whole. Ransom swiftly arose for cross-examination. Are you saying, Dr. Ward, that any public figure can say anything they want without being held accountable, regardless of how harmful it may be? Ward didn't blink. I'm stating that a fundamental component of democracy is the criticism of public leaders. We run the risk of losing something much more significant than our reputation if accountability is sacrificed for the suppression of dissent. That's the line right there, Crockett said, leaning forward. Garvey nodded, and the next witness added more fire. In her testimony, Fort Worth community organizer Angela Moreno discussed Crockett's advocacy background. She has always spoken for us when we are reluctant to speak for fear of being sued. Ransom objected, stating that it is immaterial, so what chance do the others have? However, the judge finally let the statement to stand, and Crockett herself was given the opportunity to testify. The courtroom fell silent as she got up, moved to the witness chair, and touched the Bible. Congresswoman Crockett. Garvey started as reporters leaned forward and pens poised. Crockett's voice was even, but each syllable had weight. Why did you say that LED to this lawsuit? Since you can identify patterns of influence, I think the American people deserve transparency. You don't keep quiet because protecting the powerful isn't the purpose of serving in Congress. Garvey waited a moment before asking, it's about protecting the people who sent me here. Crockett sternly said, did you intend to harm the First Lady personally? If it's harmful, I wanted to bring light where too many people favor darkness. Then, we must consider what we are safeguarding in this nation. Ransom raised for scrutiny. Congresswoman, you realize the importance of what you say. He straightened his tie before speaking. I do, don't you, and you acknowledge that your remarks implied misses. I acknowledge that I question Trump's dubious activities, but Crockett retorted. Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady but low, asking questions based on patterns we all saw, so you had no concrete proof. Mr. Ransom, evidence does not always materialize without someone posing the awkward question. The jury's gaze shifted between the two, and Ransom pressed once again to highlight it. You claim to have made false claims without providing evidence, but Crockett didn't think twice. I'm stating that I fulfilled my duties, even if doing so upsets influential people. Regardless, the courtroom was filled with murmurs when the judge's gavel pounded down the order. Crockett was not merely defending herself, she was sitting back in her chair with her chin up a little, unconcerned. She was arguing a more general point about who has the right to free speech in America, not just her versus Melania. Garvey turned back to the jury as the defense concluded for the day, saying, you've heard from my client, you've heard from experts. This is representation, not careless speech, and if we penalize it, we are penalizing democracy as a whole. Before evening deadlines, reporters hurried out to file articles, and Twitter was ablaze with news. Crocker retaliates, but I did my duty by watching the cross-examination video on repeat on cable television. Inside the courts, Crocker calmly collected her papers while commentators debated whether her defiance was brave or reckless. The contrast between the two women representing two distinct forms of strength couldn't have been more stark as Melania whispered to her lawyers. Despite the weight of history, Crockett's testimony was incredibly striking. The true shock had not yet materialized, it was lurking in the guise of an unexpected witness. By the third week of the trial, someone who could alter the outcome in less than 10 seconds. The matter seemed to be at a standstill because Crocker was falsely accused of recklessness by Melania's side. Reporters referred to it as a coin toss while Crocker's defense emphasized the importance of free expression. However, as the courthouse reopened that morning, rumors circulated among the benches that Crockett's team had a surprise in store when the court inquired about the defense's other witnesses. Yes, Your Honor, we would want to call Mr. Robert Klein. Linda. Garvey rose slowly. At first, reporters were perplexed by the name and flipped through their notes. The environment then changed as a tall man in his mid-50s approached the stand, and some people gasped. Robert Klein wasn't well known, and two people were leaning in close to each other and whispering urgently. However, he was well known among political watchers for having secretly contributed to a number of Trump administration projects. Melania's lawyers resisted, citing a contentious infrastructure agreement that detractors had questioned for years. Crockett narrowed her eyes as one of them bent over and whispered in her ear. She also cocked her head slightly. Klein, however, lifted his right hand as she folded her arms and gave herself permission to smile a little. Sat down, took the oath, and as Garvey started, his posture was straight, his face composed, and his voice steady. Could you explain your function to the court, Mr. Klein? I was a senior advisor involved in project discussions during the last government. He claimed that his remarks were measured but had weight, especially when it came to those connected to international transactions. Did you speak with the lawyer for First Lady Melania, who was shot to his feet over the issue? Garvey hardly batted an eye, Your Honor, which speaks much about the plaintiff's veracity. The judge paused, then nodded, overruling Klein's decision to fix his tie. I did. She attended a number of private sessions. Instead of remaining silent, she spoke and offered advice. When occasionally she pushed deals through, the room fell silent as a reporter's pen fell to the. Garvey leaned in as Melania's face tensed and the wooden seat echoed more than it should have. To be clear, you are claiming that the First Lady participated personally in talks that were subsequently kept secret from the public. Yes, Klein said simply, and that one word hit like a bomb. Reporters scrambled on the press benches, changing the courtroom permanently in less than 10 seconds. A few gasps echoed through the gallery as they fumbled with laptops and phones to get the quote out before anybody else did. Even the jurors glanced at each other quickly as their pens flew across pages. Melania's lawyer immediately raised another objection, claiming that the damage had already been done despite the hearsay being baseless. Regardless of the number of objections or the amount of cross-examination, Melania Trump would be perceived as mute. Garvey didn't push any farther since he was above the fray and not participating. Klein sat quietly and unflinchingly, letting the stillness do the work for her. As though he had finally been released from the burden of that reality after bearing it for years. The jury will determine how much weight to give this testimony, the judge said, clearing his throat. His eyes showed that he was aware that something seismic had just happened, even though his words were formal and routine. One lawyer shook his head as Melania turned to face her lawyers, her lips moving rapidly in whispered tones. Crockett slumped back in her chair while another person scrawled on a legal pad and looked anxiously at the jurors. She didn't need to gloat because her arms were crossed and her face was unreadable, even if her assistants behind her exchanged brief, victorious glances. When recess was called a few minutes later, the witness's words were more powerful than anything she could have said. Reporters ran for the doors as the courtroom erupted in turmoil, their phones glued to their ears. We require a video of that testimony. One person yelled into her recorder, while another person murmured, "That's it." That's when the media went into overdrive outside the courthouse steps. Camera teams are vying for position with mics pushed in all directions, according to a shocking witness. Breathlessly, one correspondent said into the camera that Melania Trump was actively participating in confidential negotiations. Her entire argument against Representative Jasmine Crockett is undermined if this is accurate. Melania remained composed and sat rigidly, gazing straight ahead. However, a slight shudder passed through her fingers as she held her pen for Crockett. The roles had been reversed, but she chose not to publicly celebrate. But for weeks, she had been portrayed as reckless and accused of making unfounded claims, and her eyes spoke for themselves. Now, a reliable source had testified that her inquiries weren't irrational but rather grounded on reality. However, the real war was about to break out outside the courtroom, so the shockwave of Klein's testimony didn't stop there. Where the impact of those 9 seconds would be determined by how the world responded. There had been intense testimonies, heated arguments, and stressful cross-examinations throughout the courtroom. However, it was nothing in comparison to the hush that ensued after Robert Klein's 9-second comment. The air only changed for 9 seconds. Trump was there during those conversations, allowing the trial's weight to shift from one side to the other like a wrecking ball. She offered suggestions and supported certain phrases that were spoken in a single line with cool accuracy. Was sufficient to send shivers through the jury room when they saw Melania Trump. For the public, who had been repeatedly informed, the disconnection from the inner workings of power abruptly collapsed. It felt like a betrayal to learn that the First Lady was apolitical and divorced from her husband's scandals. And the prolonged stillness following Klein's statement was validation for Jasmine Crockett. Silent until the judge eventually cleared his throat, but his voice lacked the customary firmness, he stated, "We'll move forward with cross-examination." In an attempt to restore control, Philip Ransom stood up fast. His stride was deliberate, but perspiration collected at his collar. "Mr. Klein's tone was severe at first, and you're implying that the First Lady had a say in high-level negotiations. Do you have any records to support this?" "I have notes from multiple meetings and emails," and Klein didn't flinch. Ransom's jaw tensed. "And have these records been presented as proof that the defense received them during discovery?" Crockett's lawyer, Garvey, sat quietly with her hands folded as that revelation hit like another thunderclap. Melania came close to Ransom, talking quickly, but Ransom persisted. "You are informing this court that the U.S. First Lady, whose position is customarily ceremonial, was negotiating. I'm saying she was more than ceremonial," Klein said equitably. "She had a part to play." The gallery erupted in gasps as people began to debate whether or not that role was appropriate. From one reporter to another, Melania's face remained expressionless throughout the story. However, others seated nearby could feel the strain in her hands as she gripped her pen more tightly, causing the plastic to bend. "That's it, that's the moment," Crockett, who was seated across the room, whispered to Garvey. Garvey gave a small nod while maintaining eye contact with the witness, Ransom, who attempted to undermine Klein's credibility. "Mr. Klein, you left your job under trying circumstances, didn't you?" "I quit because I didn't agree with some of the methods." "You have subsequently publicly opposed the Trump administration, correct?" Klein stated in a firm voice. "I've discussed topics that I think the public should be aware of, so you essentially have something to complain about." Klein pushed forward a little, saying, "I came here to tell the truth, Mr. Ransom, and I have nothing to grind. It is up to individuals what they do with the reality. The conversation had verified what needed to be verified. And nothing Ransom said could take it away since the jury were observing body language in addition to words." The judge eventually called for recess after listening for conviction, which Klein had given them both. However, instead of letting out a breath, the room burst into murmurs, sending reporters running for cover. Chaos broke out as staff outside the courthouse steps began hurriedly whispering into phones. With cameras, microphones, and cell phones pointing in all directions, today's testimony might have completely altered the. During this case, a CNN correspondent reported live that a former advisor from the Trump administration had given an oath of testimony. Melania Trump, who has always denied any involvement in the negotiations, was intimately involved in. The response was immediate on talk radio, with callers furious across the nation. Some claimed that Crockett had been correct all along, while others supported Melania's accusation of Klein being a traitor. Cable news networks displayed split screens of Melania swiftly leaving with her legal team and Crockett confidently descending the courthouse steps. A group of truckers watched the coverage from a Tulsa cafe as her face was obscured by heavy sunglasses. "I never thought she was in it like that one," his companions stated, shaking their heads. "They all are, they simply cover it up better for Crockett, whose evidence went beyond a court win." Clips of her composed response played repeatedly that evening, which was a political goldmine. Pundits called it a turning point in contrast to Melania's reticent silence. Back in her defense office that evening, Crockett discussed the trial and her career. Garvey stated softly as Crockett's squad again played the film for 9 seconds. Crockett leaned back, her face displaying tiredness, but her eyes glowed with resolve. She claimed that instead of breaking their story, they believed that bringing me in here would break me. The lesson was clear: sometimes the impact of a single statement is more important than the length of testimony. And Robert Klein had swung the historical balance in those 9 seconds, but the testimony was as dramatic as it was. Even more dramatic was the fallout outside the courtroom, which would affect more than just the verdict. However, both women's future reputations in the hours following Robert Klein's testimony felt more like a national emergency broadcast than a court case, and his 9-second revelation was cut off in a matter of minutes. Cable anchors played it in slow motion with subtitles and broadcast it on all major news outlets. Every word was examined by commentators, and the trial's hashtags trended globally. There was mayhem at the Dallas courthouse, with reporters jamming the hallways and yelling questions at everyone. One journalist shouted at a political analyst, "Do you think the First Lady lied, and who even touched the suit?" Protesters on both sides rushed at barricades outside as they attempted to flee inside an elevator. Police presence quadrupled to prevent tensions from erupting as chanting became louder than before. There was a somber atmosphere in the Trump legal camp as Melania sat with her lawyers. Her face was pale, but she maintained her cool in a private conference room. "We need to control this," she stated quietly. Her voice had the coldness of someone used to being ordered, and Ransom shook his head, perspiring at his. Temple's authority vanished the instant he made the statement on oath, and it became a public fact. Although we can contest the evidence, the harm has already been done. Jasmine Crockett's crew was humming with suppressed. Garvey roamed the floor while aides gathered around laptops, browsing through live coverage. Despite a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth, Crockett herself sat quietly at the table with her arms folded. She said, almost to herself, "Don't bring me to court unless you're prepared to face the truth," when I told them. The trial was aired on a neighborhood coffee shop's television, and the impact extended well beyond the Dallas courthouse. Customers set down their cups to hear pundits discuss the consequences of her supposedly untouchable status. Legislators rushed to make statements when one woman whispered that her buddy shook her head, saying that no one is untouchable anymore in Washington. Democrats leapt to Melania's rescue as some Republicans hurried to defend Klein, a disgruntled former employee, seeking attention. On the Capitol steps, a lawmaker said that Representative Crockett had been vindicated and that the lawsuit was never about the facts. It involved intimidation, but it backfired, and the public's response was chaotic. Social media footage of Crockett firmly descending the courthouse stairs was polarizing and unvarnished. Became well known with the subtitles, "Fearless in Truth Doesn't Bow," and videos of Melania departing under strict protection. Her face obscured by huge sunglasses went viral with hashtags implying scandal and concealment. When you made your 9-second courtroom appearance, one host joked that even late-night television played a role. Undermines the First Lady's argument, you should be awarded a medal or at the very least a Netflix special. Although the audience erupted in laughter, it was evident that the trial had become part of popular culture, influencing opinions outside of the courtroom, even though the atmosphere was different in the jury room. Every night, jurors avoided making eye contact with reporters as they hurried to their automobiles. However, their notes highlighted terms like control, credibility, and truth in the story. No amount of legal wrangling could undo the mark Klein's testimony had left. Supporters of Melania weren't quiet, however. Outside the courthouse, a Plano lady held up a placard that said, "Side with Melania," who told a reporter that they were trying to discredit her by dragging her name through the MUD. Her voice trembled with conviction due to her strength and grace, but Crockett's opportunity drowned out what she had to say. Crockett experienced absolutely unreal blowback from counter-protesters who were only a few feet away. Instead of celebrating with her staff at her kitchen table that evening, she went back to her little Dallas apartment. "I don't feel like I won," she said softly over the phone with her sister. "The nation seems to have just had a curtain pulled back, and now everyone must choose how to respond to what they have witnessed." "You stood your ground, Jazz, that's what's important, others are watching," her sister said. Melania withdrew even further into silence, "But they'll remember that you didn't bend." She stayed away from cameras, made no statement, and let her lawyers handle the situation. Speaking now carried too much risk for someone whose reputation had been established on grace and reserve. However, quiet also spoke loudly, and by the following morning, the story had solidified. Jasmine Crockett was amplified by the lawsuit that was intended to silence her. The trial was no longer solely about slander. It concerned perceptions of reality and the costs of attempting to use the legal system as a weapon while the country looked on. When the legal struggle was coming to a close, the actual question was more pressing than ever: how would this story end? And what lesson would be left after the trials last week, when the gavel finally fell? The courthouse resembled a stage where history had been written line by line rather than a structure dedicated to the practice of law. By that point, there was more conversation than chance in the air outside. People congregated on the courthouse steps to discuss what they had witnessed in addition to waving signs. Students and retiree families squabbled as they ate lunch from food carts in the area. Discussing the same issue: was power at issue in this litigation, or was truth at stake? Philip Ransom stood erect at the plaintiff's table as closing arguments presented the story in radically different ways. His voice echoing around the room: "You can't let public servants talk carelessly. Regarding private individuals, even if they are the First Lady, reputations and words count." He paused, pointing to Melania, saying that if we breach that barrier, nobody is protected. She sat motionless, her hands clasped, her eyes downcast as if she were attempting to convey both injury and respect. When it was Linda Garvey's time, she approached the jury directly rather than walking to the podium. "The purpose of this case is not to preserve reputations," as her heels clicked lightly on the tile. "It's about punishing truth," she said in a calm but fiery tone. The questions that Representative Crockett asked aloud were already being whispered by millions of Americans. The response to those queries that came too close to authority was to suppress them rather than respond to them, which is unfair. That is not democracy. She paused, then said, "Ask yourselves. What does it say for the rest of us if a congresswoman may be brought to court for performing her duties? What does it mean to have the freedom to speak up and demand honesty from leaders?" Crockett's eyes shifted steadily in the direction of the jury. She was just there, not grinning or furious. A woman who sat tall as discussions started after weeks of inspection. Reporters walked the hallway as supporters of both women sat in groups as the courtroom fell into tense stillness. Hours of rehearsing talking points or reciting prayers stretched into a day. The jury had finally returned a verdict when the buzzer sounded, and everyone filed back in as the judge requested silence. We, the jurors, watched the foreperson hold a sheet of paper that was shaky in her hands. The statements rang sharply and definitively in favor of the defendant, Representative Jasmine Crockett. Before the judge's gavel smashed down, Crockett's supporters let out muffled cheers, but Melania remained motionless and composed. However, something in her eyes flickered that the camera was unable to fully capture, a knowledge that her case. Crockett put a palm to her chest and slowly exhaled after her gamble had fallen apart, then turned to face Garvey. She just briefly closed her eyes without gloating or throwing a huge party. The courthouse steps turned into a scene of celebration as though to proclaim, "I held the line outside." Expressing indignation simultaneously, Crockett spoke to the audience for a short while, saying, "This wasn't about me." Her voice reverberated through the microphones as she discussed the freedom to express oneself and the opportunity to pose challenging inquiries. And the duty we all have to hold those in authority accountable. If we fail to do so, our democracy will be lost. Her remarks were aired repeatedly on television networks for hours, reaching well beyond Dallas. Even though detractors acknowledged that she had remained steadfast in the face of tremendous criticism for Melania, editorials commended her bravery. She remained silent for a while, allowing her lawyers to assert that they would weigh their alternatives. However, the public narrative was already written and wasn't favorable to her in living rooms all over the nation. Families discussed the trial. Some believed it demonstrated that no one, not even the First Lady, should be above scrutiny. Nearly everyone agreed on one issue, while others were concerned that it indicated a reduction in respect for public officials. Americans were compelled by the trial to carefully consider the delicate balance between free speech and one's reputation. The lesson was not only legal. Human words are important because they have the power to injure, heal, and shape legacies. However, it can be riskier to silence speech out of fear than to confront it. Jasmine Crockett's triumph wasn't only hers. It served as a reminder that even though the truth is uncomfortable, it is worth preserving. And perhaps that's why the story struck such a deep chord in a nation founded on voices. The biggest danger isn't what is said in courtrooms, Congress, or on the streets. The biggest danger arises when their voices are silenced, which is why Crockett fled the courts on that last day. With cameras blazing in her face and reporters yelling her name, she took her time going down the stairs, purposefully trying to look as much like someone who was aware of the gravity of what had just transpired as possible. And whatever of your opinion of her, there was no denying that she had defied authority. And authority had initially blinked. The story ended, but the lesson, never undervalue the impact of truth stated out loud, remained. If you believe tales like this matter, if you believe voices that challenge power, even when it shakes the walls of power, should be heard before subscribing, as we are only beginning.